So I worked on this project for 3 years, and it's been a really important experience and quite a welcome educative experience for me. And in this presentation, I'm going to just pick out some of the aspects of it which perhaps will lead to conversation. When we published the report, in the tablet, there was a short review of it by a survivor. And this is what she said. You can see on this slide here that the report succeeds in creating a space, a non-judgmental, safe space in which to express ourselves and have careful conversations around survivorship and safeguarding. And I was really grateful for this quote because our main hope for the research, and indeed for the work that follows from it, is that people engage in conversations. And that's what we hope we'll do tonight. I'd probably extend this a little bit and say we need to talk about not just about survivorship and safeguarding, though those are huge priorities, but also about the meaning and implications of the abuse crisis. Its meaning extends far beyond the practices which we've come to regard as essential, and it's those bigger dimensions, those bigger horizons, which has been our subject. Just in case it's new to anyone, we're just going to review quickly what the research was about. What we were trying to do was look at Catholic culture and systems and very carefully describe these as implicated in how abuse happens and how the response has often been inadequate, and then to make a constructive contribution to healing and a healthier church. The main strength of our research is the amount of listening that we did in 82 interviews and 4 focus groups. We also did a quantitative survey, which we can talk about another time, which isn't really our subject tonight, but is also valuable. And what was distinctive about it was what we described as a whole church approach. In other words, we were trying to listen to as many of the voices of people affected by the abuse crisis as we could. So priests, bishops, survivors, family members, safeguarding parish representatives, religious communities, lay people in many different roles in parishes. And to stress that, again, that we're not concerned with cases or policy, but with the meaning of the crisis. And this is what we were doing, the process. And in a sense, in what we're doing here tonight, I'm inviting you to do the same process. And possibly it's a process that you already find yourselves doing. That first of all, we listen to all these different voices. And then secondly, we discern and analyze the habits and structures and attitudes and ideas that are implicated in how abuse happened. And those two words, discern and analyze, are important because they're slightly different activities. Discern is in many ways an activity of faith, something that we do with a sense of the guidance of the Spirit and of what somebody that I read today called the canopy of grace, the horizon of the church and its mission that we all live within. Whereas analyze often feels like a more perhaps an academic word, an objective word, and is also part of what we tried to do, to look in a very rigorous and disciplined way at what people were saying. And then to explore ideas from Catholic teaching, which lie underneath all these habits and practices. And this idea we had of untying knots in Catholic teaching. And then last, to try and imagine practical ways forward, which will restore or repair what has been lost or taken away. And you can see here some of the themes. Any of you that have looked at the report will have even look at the contents pages, they'll be familiar. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but you can glance at them just as I'm talking. Again, the first column is about our attitudes, our habits, our understandings that we only perhaps discover by reflecting on them. So particularly the idea of being bystanders, that whole question of whether we feel implicated, whether we feel that in some way we've colluded with silencers, with not challenging behaviour, with not asking the kind of questions that may be needed to be asked. So each of those has got a great deal behind it. And then trying to tug out from the habits and cultural patterns, the theological themes that lie beneath, such as the huge theme of what the Spirit is saying to us in the church through this crisis. And crucially, we were seeing those affected as including not just the individuals who are victims and survivors, but also the whole parishes, the communities that were affected, the priests who were affected, the bishops who were affected, the religious communities, to understand that this crisis has affected huge numbers of people. Obviously, victims and survivors always come first, but the other people who are affected too carry burdens of pain and grief. Whether it's a priest who finds that his classmate, who he's known for 40 years, has been arrested and imprisoned, or the bishop who inherits a situation that he wasn't even in the diocese when it happened, or the parish community where a priest disappears and they simply don't know and they have to face questions like if he is abused, was it somebody I knew? Was it even in my family? So many of the questions that in many parishes that are affected have not been answered. And if there's a running theme, it's this idea that we need to talk about all of these matters and learn how to talk about them honestly and wisely so that we can do what a theologian I was reading today, Brueggemann, calls transformative listening or emancipatory listening, that our humanness, our capacity to grow and be real depends on us being faithfully heard, he said. And that's why these conversations are important. And we took a great deal of inspiration from um, Pope Francis's line at the beginning of one of his documents that to move forward, we need a continuous and profound conversion of hearts, attested by concrete and effective actions that involve everyone in the church. I mean, each of those phrases is so crucial. This is about conversion, not just policy change and or new practices. It's about what happens in our hearts and our understanding. And it has to lead to concrete and effective actions, and it's all of us. We're all responsible for it. And so the focus question Claire and I are working around is what do we learn from listening to survivors and others directly affected by the abuse crisis? And what meaning can we find in this experience? And we come with what we've learned from the research, but we know that you too will have done listening and you will have perhaps probed for yourselves the meanings to be found, the deeper questions that emerge. And that's why we hope the seminar tonight is a conversation. We're as interested in listening to you as we are trying to tease out some of what may be useful from our research. So what I'm going to do is just pick out 4 or 5 quotes quite quickly. And they're quotes that for me became absolutely crucial. We had, I don't know, maybe 20,000 pages of data. We had a vast amount of data. And we read interviews, 82 interviews of about 30 or 40 pages each, over and over again, and coded them and analysed them by theme. Yet, despite all of that rigor and systematic approach, very often there is one line or one part of what somebody said that orients, catalyzes, organizes the reflection that we do on it. And so I'm just going to pick out a few of them that pick up for me, that point to the kinds of conversation that we need to have. And the first one is this, and it sticks in my mind a great deal. This was a man in his 70s who'd had a life with it, had a lot of illness, been abused as a teenage boy. And he said, I get by, but it's not by any means a happy, right, I'd say there's certainly happiness that's in it, but it's not by any means a fulfilled life. It's a reminder that even when we have sorted out all our policies perfectly, even when we have our practices right, we live in a community in which there are people still carrying this grief and sadness and diminishment. And it's always and still our responsibility to work out how to accompany, how to listen, how to learn. So for me, this is a kind of little lodestone to remember that when any member of the church, indeed any member of our communities and our society, our particular responsibilities in the church, any member of the church is not living a fulfilled life, then we need to look at the reasons why. The second one is this, which anyone who's read the report will probably find. And this is again a survivor who was in his 60s or 70s, again abused as a young boy. But for him, what was worse or as bad is what's happened since he's tried to disclose, where he talks about how the secondary psychological abuse is the power of the institution and how the institution treats you, how it ignores you and doesn't want to know you. He says it's sometimes harder to deal with because you're not just up against something that's happened a long time ago. You can process that, you can come to terms with it in your head. But this secondary abuse tends to stay with you, and it's harder to deal with because it's in your face all the time. as we progressed through the research, we realized that the focus was shifting from how did the abuse happen, which is always a crucial question, but fairly well researched, to why has the response failed so badly? Why have we got it so wrong? And we could hear through a lot of the survivors the question, why is it that this church, which I believed in and which I loved and grew up in, why has this church so failed to listen to me and believe me and help with my healing? And that's a cry that resonates. You could describe it perhaps as a lament. It's a great sadness and it's a great challenge. And it's one that we are still in the process of meeting, as is well acknowledged by the Pope and many other people around the world. But it's also a very difficult one because this is an area where, and I hope I'm be delighted if there are some survivors among us today, where everyone has different views about the right next steps to take. And it's some people want to express anger and challenge and campaign, and some people want to be reconciled and in dialogue and mutual understanding. Some people want all of these things. So we live in a messy situation where people have very different needs, and all of them are valid. All these paths are valid. And so we have to learn the ways that, the variety of ways that will respond to the different needs that will somehow restore not just the primary abuse that happened, but also the secondary abuse that comes from the failure of response. My third quote is one I find extremely poignant. This was from a woman in a parish where a priest had been imprisoned after abuse, and the parish only found out by reading in the local newspaper. And she'd been a lifetime active member of the church. She was a leader. She actually had experienced physical abuse and neglect as a child, but that was in her background. She'd still lived an incredibly faithful life in the church. And she said it would have been good to have somebody come and explain to the parishes that had been sort of damaged, what had gone on. But it was what you'd come to expect, that you're not really told anything. And you'll find out when and if you need to. I find this so distressing, this quote, because it's such a sadness that we haven't worked out how to engage all the baptized, all the lay people in the church, and treat us as adults who are competent to know, competent to respond well, competent to find the compassion and guide the church towards the justice that is needed. It's a kind of, I hesitate to use the word abuse because it's such a serious word, but it's a misuse of who we are and of what we can be. And it points to so many issues that we need to change, the silences we need to break, the relationships that need to be different, the communication that we need to learn how to do. One of the phrases that comes to mind from this quote is that when this happens, it's both an injustice and a wound in the whole community. And as yet, we've done little to gather expertise on how to develop good practice in parishes that have lost a priest or were a priest that has served them that they later find out has abused. We're still at the foothills of finding of that learning journey. And we need to ask the questions such as, why is it like this? Why are the expectations so low? Why don't we know what people, why can we not find ways to be far more honest with people? And the fourth quote I want to highlight is one that, more than any other, set the direction for the report. And this is a guy whose experience of what we've called mishandling was particularly grievous and particularly painful. I can't go into his story in any detail, but he had been actively disbelieved, prodded, he said, by a priest saying things like, "Are you sure you aren't imagining it?" It was a very distressing story. And this is not just in the past, this is within the last decade or so, and even through the years in which ICSA, the National Inquiry, was going on. And he said quite sadly, almost in passing, "I just thought a wrong has been committed. There must be a process of where right is done." And even 5 or 6 years later with the church, I thought the same, like a fool. This is another terribly sad perspective to encounter. But what it pointed to for me is this real sense that what we're about here is justice. That a wrong has been committed and we can't undo it. We cannot take away the fact that abuse has happened. But that wrong has been consolidated by wrongs in the process. And if wrong has been done in the process of how we've handled it as a church, then we have to find a process of where right is done. And that led me in particular to a set of ideas that are summed up in this phrase, restorative approaches, where we try and look at the different models of how we can do something to mend and restore relationships, not between the survivor or victim and the abuser. That's a much more complex matter and not within ordinary expertise. But restorative approaches for the breach in relationships and the failure that's happened between survivors and the body of the church. And that's all of us, not just the authorities. So we look in the report at different models of restorative justice, truth commissions, truth and reconciliation commissions, and healing circles. Spaces in which people can ask questions and receive answers, where harm is acknowledged and crucially, accountability is accepted. And these can happen alongside legal processes and redress. They're not an alternative, they're a complementary thing if we plan it in the right way so that it can happen in a way that so that these processes talk to each other. And of course, it must be victim-led and trauma-informed. But that idea that we need to focus on where right is a process of where right is done is really an example of how the insight of a survivor, quite a simple insight, shapes the whole output of what we were doing, shapes the whole vision that we built as a result of our listening. And then just a couple of other quotes, just to illustrate the variety of ways in which different people in the church are affected. We interviewed several bishops, and this is a bishop talking about his conversations with survivors. And he said, only I could say to them, I have no right to expect this from you, but you have every right to hear from me that I ask your forgiveness. You have a right to be asked for that forgiveness. We have no right to expect it, but that has to be done by the church, and within the church. And this one always strikes me very poignantly because we need to work through the question of whether an apology works or not. There have been many apologies from bishops, from the Pope, from bodies in Rome, and sometimes they're repeated over and over again. Sometimes they land, sometimes they make a difference to survivors and communities, and sometimes they don't. And we need to understand why. We need to understand what makes it authentic, what makes it real, and what is the right way to go about doing it. Because, as the bishop says here, anyone who is a survivor of abuse in the church has a right to hear, to be asked for their forgiveness. And for some, this has not yet happened. One of the things that was striking about our research was that, in contrast with what happens when bishops speak collectively and publicly, where they often sound quite formal and it's often a statement arrived at through consensus and voting, whereas when they were able to speak anonymously in the confidentiality of a research interview, they spoke with deep personal engagement and huge humility. And this is a quote from another bishop where he says, if we're incapable of empathizing and feeling compassion to those who present themselves in pain, then what on earth is happening? The heart of the church is a crucified Lord, and our response has got to be one that stands at the foot of the cross, like Our Lady, weeping at the foot of that cross. You don't stand to the side, dispassionately making theological observations. You run to the foot of the cross, and you grasp at the foot, and you kiss it. And that's the proper response to suffering, not dispassion, but compassion. And I hope you can sense in that quote that this is somebody who really cares. This is somebody who really got through to the survivors that he listened to, because we heard testimonies from both sides. And it helps us to see again that if we can open up spaces for honest conversation, where people, whatever their status or role or office in the church, are able to talk from deep conscience and faith and humanity about what's at stake and what happens when we listen and what we really feel, then I believe we will find the ways forward. That we'll find dimensions of healing that are not possible in any other way. And then the last one, this is a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but this one's very short. And it was an idea that we picked up from Archbishop Scicluna, a key advisor to the Pope who's handled a lot of the most difficult cases. And it was a dialogue he was having with a moral theologian. And he just used this simple phrase, accountability is redemptive. And again, that's been a bit of a signal for me that's carried on through the research and since, that we have to get to grips with ordinary accountability at every level of life in the church. We have to get to grips with the kinds of practices which work for us. And I hope in the report we outline some of the theology which might underpin that. Most of us in our professional lives, or if we're not, don't have those professional lives, we know about others do find systems of accountability built into what happens as their normal. So we can do this. But most importantly, I think there's this idea that if we do that, we will be better for it. We will gain from it. It will be part of what redeems us from the failure that in some ways we all participate in. So for me, this idea that not only that we have to tackle accountability and not just as I got here, put it in a code of conduct, which is hugely important, but then take that code of conduct forward and express it in actual practices at parish level. And, I think both Claire and I come not just from the point of view of looking at this as academics, but also as people who are in parish life and diocesan life and organisational life and know what is not there and what is there. So those are just maybe half a dozen of the quotes that, for me, point to some of the big themes and questions